Did you know that 40% of readers say they choose a book based on the strength of its villain? That's right, your antagonist might be the reason people pick up your story in the first place. Yet, many new fantasy writers make the same mistakes when crafting their villains, and it's killing their stories. In fact, according to research by Fantasy Book Review, nearly 60% of readers feel unsatisfied with the villains in the books they read. Why? Because most villains are too one-dimensional, too weak, or even worse, too perfect. In this video, we're going to fix that. We'll explore the 6 most common mistakes new fantasy writers make when creating their antagonists, and more importantly, how to avoid them. By the end, you'll know exactly how to make your villain unforgettable, and give your readers a reason to keep turning the pages. Ready to turn your fantasy antagonist into a real force to be reckoned with? Let's dive in. Chapter 1, The Flawed Villain. When antagonists are too perfect when creating an antagonist, many new fantasy writers make the mistake of crafting a villain who's just too perfect. They might be overpowered, unstoppable, or have no weaknesses at all. While this may seem like a good way to make a villain seem scary, it actually makes them less interesting. Think about it, if a villain has no flaws, they become predictable. In The Lord of the Rings, Sauron is terrifying not because he's unbeatable, but because his evil is driven by a deep desire for control. His flaws, his need for the One Ring, make him a force to be reckoned with. A great villain isn't flawless. They have doubts, insecurities, and even weaknesses that make them human. According to writer Brandon Sanderson, a good antagonist is a mirror for the protagonist's flaws. If your antagonist reflects some of your hero's darkest qualities, it adds complexity. They should challenge the protagonist not only with physical power but by pushing their moral boundaries. So, how can you fix this mistake? Start by giving your villain weaknesses or vulnerabilities. Maybe your antagonist is overly ambitious or has a tragic backstory that fuels their actions. If the villain's perfect, the stakes become flat, and the conflict loses its tension. Instead, create a villain that your audience can relate to, even if they don't agree with their methods. The more relatable they are, the more your readers will care about the outcome. Chapter 2, The Silent Threat. Antagonists who never do anything. Have you ever read a fantasy novel where the antagonist seems like an afterthought? They're just lurking in the background, barely involved in the action. This is another common mistake for new writers. A passive antagonist might sound like a good idea, but in reality, it kills the plot. In J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series, Voldemort doesn't sit idly by. He's constantly making moves, creating chaos, and forcing Harry to respond. This is why he's so terrifying, he never stops. A great antagonist is always in motion. Even if they're not physically fighting the hero, they should be manipulating events, creating obstacles, and pushing the plot forward. In George R.R. Martin's A Game of Thrones, characters like Cersei Lannister and Littlefinger are constantly scheming and moving behind the scenes, ensuring that their plans never stall. The villain might not always be on the front lines, but their influence should be felt throughout the story. So, what's the solution? Keep your antagonist active. Even if they don't directly face the hero, their actions should be felt in the world around them. For example, a villain might spread rumors, stir up conflicts, or control key resources. These actions force your protagonist to react, which makes for a more engaging story. A villain should never be static, they should evolve, adapt, and keep the hero on their toes. If you're finding these tips useful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to get more expert writing advice. Chapter 3, The Misunderstood Monster. Antagonists without motivation. Another big mistake new fantasy writers make is creating antagonists without clear motivation. Villains who act purely out of malice or for the sake of being evil don't feel real. Great villains have reasons for what they do, even if those reasons are twisted or misguided. In The Hunger Games, President Snow's actions make sense in the context of his desire for power. He believes that his harsh rule is necessary to maintain order, even though his methods are cruel. His motivation, though warped, adds layers to his character. Without clear motivation, a villain can feel like a cardboard cutout. A villain who just wants to take over the world, or destroy everything, doesn't offer much for the reader to sink their teeth into. Readers want to understand why the antagonist does what they do, even if they don't agree with their actions. According to author and screenwriter Robert McKee, a character's goal defines their nature. If the antagonist's goal is believable, the entire conflict becomes more compelling. To fix this, you need to give your antagonist a clear motivation. Ask yourself, what does my antagonist want? Why do they want it? What are they willing to do to achieve it? Even if the desires are extreme or dark, the key is making those desires understandable. Maybe the antagonist wants revenge for a past wrong, or they're trying to protect their people in a twisted way. The more you flesh out your villain's motivation, the more the audience will be invested in the outcome of the story. Remember, every villain is the hero of their own story. They think they're doing the right thing. Don't forget to subscribe to get more tips on crafting complex characters. Chapter 4, The All-Powerful Overlord, Why Your Antagonist Shouldn't Be Invincible. A common pitfall for new fantasy writers is creating a villain who seems unbeatable. The idea of an all-powerful antagonist may sound appealing, but it can lead to a flat, unengaging story. In The Lord of the Rings, Sauron's strength is legendary, but his vulnerability lies in the One Ring. This flaw creates the tension that drives the entire series. If your antagonist is invincible, there's no real danger for your protagonist, and the story loses its edge. Think of it this way: if the hero can never defeat the villain, why should the audience care? The key to a compelling villain is vulnerability. Even the strongest antagonists have weaknesses, whether physical, emotional, or moral. In the Witcher series, the antagonist, Emhyr var Emreis, is powerful, but his obsessive control and blind ambition ultimately lead to his downfall. By giving your villain flaws or limitations, you add depth and complexity to the story. If your antagonist is too powerful, the stakes become meaningless. There's no tension because the hero's struggle feels pointless. By making the villain more human, with real weaknesses, you create opportunities for the hero to grow. For instance, a villain's arrogance could lead to their defeat, or their overconfidence might be their undoing. This makes the story feel more dynamic and unpredictable. To fix this, ensure your antagonist has weaknesses. Maybe they're emotionally vulnerable, physically limited, or burdened by a past mistake. The best villains often have a fatal flaw that the hero can exploit. Think of Darth Vader in Star Wars. His connection to his son, Luke, becomes his greatest weakness. This vulnerability not only makes him more relatable but also provides a powerful emotional payoff for the audience. Chapter 5, The One-Dimensional Villain. When antagonists lack depth, one-dimensional villains are another mistake new writers often make. These are the characters who are evil just because they enjoy it, without any deeper reasoning or motivation. In The Lion King, Scar starts as a typical villain. He wants to take over the throne. However, as the story unfolds, we learn more about his jealousy and feelings of abandonment. This gives him depth, making him more than just a simple antagonist. A villain without depth often comes across as a mere obstacle for the protagonist. They lack personality, backstory, or even a clear goal. But a great antagonist is more than just someone who creates problems for the hero. They have desires, fears, and beliefs that drive their actions. In Harry Potter, Tom Riddle, Lord Voldemort, isn't just evil for the sake of it. His fear of death and his obsession with immortality shape his every action. To create a deep antagonist, consider giving him a complex backstory. Why are they the way they are? What events in their life shape their current motivations? This doesn't mean your villain has to be sympathetic, but understanding their past can give them a rich, believable personality. In A Song of Ice and Fire, characters like Jaime Lannister and Sandor Clegane show how deep flaws and conflicting motivations can turn a seemingly evil character into a complex and compelling figure. Also, think about how your villain's personality can reflect the themes of your story. A villain who contrasts with your hero in meaningful ways makes for a stronger conflict. If your protagonist values freedom, perhaps your antagonist values control. These opposing views create a tension that goes beyond just good versus evil. Chapter 6, The Antagonist Without Stakes. When the villain doesn't matter. Have you ever read a story where the antagonist doesn't really feel important to the plot? This is a major problem in fantasy writing. An antagonist who doesn't matter, or whose actions have no real impact on the protagonist or the world, makes the story feel flat and unimportant. In The Hunger Games, President Snow is more than just a villain. His oppressive rule affects every aspect of Katniss's life and the lives of millions in Panem. Without him, there would be no story. The villain should always feel like a real threat, someone who has stakes in the outcome of the story. If the antagonist doesn't pose a significant challenge to the hero, there's no real tension. In the Chronicles of Narnia, the White Witch's curse on Narnia creates an environment where nothing grows, and the world is stuck in eternal winter. Her presence is deeply felt by the characters and drives the entire plot forward. This is the kind of antagonist you need, someone whose stakes are woven tightly into the world and the story. To fix this, you need to make sure your antagonist's goals directly conflict with your protagonists. Their actions should have real consequences that force the hero to take action. The stakes don't have to be world-ending, but they should matter on a personal level to the hero. In The Hobbit, Smaug's hoarding of the treasure is a personal issue for Bilbo and the dwarves. They aren't just fighting for the treasure, they're fighting for their future and their sense of home. A great way to raise the stakes is to give your antagonist the power to affect the protagonist on a personal level. Maybe the villain threatens someone the hero loves, or perhaps they hold the key to the hero's greatest fear. These personal stakes create a stronger connection between the antagonist and the protagonist, making the final showdown more meaningful.